morning, everyone. My name is Lindsey Snider. I go to Emmanuel College in Boston. I'm a senior, and I intend to present this paper as my senior thesis later in May. So I am covering the Daríen Gap, which I'll get into in a little bit because it's a little bit unknown, especially in the media, given the topic of this presentation. So first I'll go into some more detail about what that is, my methodology, my results, and then what the implications of my research is, especially from my perspective. All right, so this is the Daríen Gap. It's a little bit difficult to see from this kind of small image, but it's basically the bottleneck where Central America and South America meet. And it is a very dangerous area just because it's mostly autonomous indigenous area, especially coming from the Panama and the Hunan province. And it's also just very dense jungle where there isn't really any stable ground. A lot of the literature is actually about the Daríen, is about the Pan American Highway campaign, which was a campaign in the 20th century to essentially try to build a highway from pole to pole, so from Alaska to Argentina. And one of the only places that they couldn't build the highway was in the Daríen because of the rough terrain, the swamps, the jungle. It's just very difficult to move through. And since the pandemic, people have been migrating through this area due to visa restrictions in the United States and overall just being more difficult to get to the United States except for on foot and passing through this area, which has made it a very dangerous scene. It's considered by some to be the third largest humanitarian crisis in the world right now, and especially when it comes to Haitian and Venezuelan refugees, this is a very important area to consider. But again, there hasn't really been any scholarly discourse on it. It's limited to the Pan American Highway or anthropological or biological research. So these are just some of the dangers of the Daríen. Sexual abuse is rampant and often underreported. There's a lack of authorities, government authorities and also NGOs. They try their best, but it just isn't enough. There's unaccompanied children, there's severe disease from the contaminated environment. Unfortunately, a lot of bodies are left and it contaminates the water. People drink the water and they get very sick. There's obviously a lack of health care, there's wild animals, drug trafficking, organized crime is very prevalent. They have a large control over governance in the area, and because of that, drug traffickers are also human traffickers, and that can be very exploitative economically and also just physically. So these are just some descriptive statistics to kind of put this in a frame of the geography and also the time. So the most recent statistic that we have is provided by the Panamanian government. Almost 500,000 people crossed just in 2023. This number went up in the beginning of 2024. And this is a 7,000% increase from 2019, which was only a few thousand people. I think it was only like 3,000 or 4,000 people crossing through this region. Now it's to over 500,000. And there have been at least 55 deaths last year, but clearly that number is undercounted. So to tackle this region, I was very curious about researching how the Panamanian and Colombian newspapers explain the governance, especially how do Panamanian newspapers talk about Colombia and how do Colombian newspapers talk about Panama, especially when it comes to governance, because this migration crisis has such an impact on the communities and is kind of overrunning, especially as the Panamanian newspapers will argue, is overrunning their small country. So to do this, I employ a mixed method content analysis, which is essentially reading newspapers and grading them. I chose a bunch of different categories, such as foreign policy, security, health, which encompasses sexual abuse, security, how they talk about the presidents, stuff like that. Looked at a bunch of different categories. So the first part of my analysis is qualitative. So what information are these newspapers using to talk about the crises and the events that happen in this area? And then I used a quantitative analysis where I made a scoring guide, which I'll show in the next slide, to kind of grade if this information framed what was happening in a supportive light or a more critical light. So I read 200 newspaper articles, 100 for each newspaper. I chose, for Colombia, I chose El Tiempo, which is the most popular, most read daily newspaper in Colombia. La Estrella de Panama is the oldest newspaper in the country. And I used a sampling frame from April 2020, so from the pandemic, because that's when it really started to pick up. There was a very intense effect of the pandemic on the economies and also the Venezuelan and Haitian crises. And then to October 2024, right before the election of Donald Trump in the United States. All right, so this is my grade point guide that I utilized. So if I gave it 1, or if I gave it 0, if it didn't really talk about like a given topic, this is for my quantitative analysis. But 1 is very critical, so it uses strongly negative, highly critical language and tone to kind of talk about something in a negative light, that it isn't having a good impact on their country or migrants or whatever the category is. All the way up to 5 being overwhelmingly positive, highly supportive. This is a good thing for the migrants, it's a good thing for the country, or whatever, you know, the economy, public health, whatever the topic is. So first I'll start with my qualitative results. So overall, and this is especially interesting because I'm not Latina, I'm also not very fluent in Spanish, but I have a very elementary understanding of it. And also coming from the US, I thought that it was interesting to see how balanced their views on migrants were for both of the newspapers. They really tried to explain it with empathy and understanding of why these migrants are motivated and to migrate to North America, whether it's Mexico, the United States, Canada. But with La Estrella, they really tried to talk about the burden on the state, and I thought this was very interesting, just talking about geography and the history of these countries. So Panama got independence from Colombia. They're a much smaller country, basically created out of the building of the Panama Canal. Even though they're wealthier than Colombia per capita, they are much smaller geographically and don't really have the capacity, even though they are a leader in migration. So they really try to emphasize, yes, we are trying to guarantee the human rights of these migrants. However, it's putting a toll on our country, and we need help from the international community to help get to the root causes of migration. Versus Colombia, they actually contribute to migration. There are about 2,000 Colombians who leave every day, and this was coming from a special article by El Tiempo covering the push factors of why Colombians, their own people, are choosing to leave. And I think they have a much different approach. Yes, they want to guarantee the human rights, but they also want to protect the right of these migrants to move. And so that's kind of the difference in their approaches towards framing migration. But it's interesting because La Estrella really tried to celebrate that they are really a leader in the region by having ERMs, which are essentially stations that collect biometric data. And El Tiempo celebrates this because the Colombian government, they're critical that the Colombian government kind of has a lack of authority over the region to provide them information as a newspaper. And they have to get actually a lot of their data from the Panamanian government, which I thought was very interesting. And also there was more presidential coverage with the election of the Panamanian president, Jose Raul Mulino. He was elected in June 2024, and he has taken a much stronger, more, I guess, authoritarian, top-down approach when it comes to tackling migration and trying to mitigate it as much as he can. And he also signed a deal with the Biden administration, a $6 million deal to host repatriation flights, which has caused some of the tension, and that's why I'm curious about the bilateral relations, because they've actually been sending a lot of people, especially back to Colombia, that have entered the country illegally, and that's part of their mitigation campaign. And this has obviously caused some tension with President Petro of Colombia, who has said that I don't want to hit migrants with a whip, kind of insinuating that that's what Panama's doing, denying their human rights, the right to move through their country. And also he's proposed a alternative to the Panama Canal by building a railroad from the Pacific to the Atlantic, which has also caused some tensions that I think is kind of surrounding this migration crisis. But I will say both newspapers focus on the impact of unaccompanied children passing through. There's a lot of coverage on that, a lot of coverage on women and sexual abuse that occurs. And I think that is kind of highlighting the innocence of these people who are being affected by this migration crisis. And they also are very outwardly spoken about blaming IGOs, especially the UN and UNHCR, UNICEF, for criticizing them, but not giving them the resources that they need to actually implement the solutions that they recommend. So this is also something very interesting, blaming the international community for the blame kind of being put on them as countries, because this is where the crisis is happening, but it's not necessarily their fault. So this is my quantitative results. So my statistical analysis is kind of elementary. So I tried to just look at the means. So does it fall closer to 1? Does it come closer to 5? And my first hypothesis was that La Estrella would be more critical of Colombia than El Tiempo is of Panama. And this seemed to be true when I aggregated all of the scores. But for the second hypothesis, I thought that overall, both newspapers should support their home government and be more critical of the other government. So Panama would be more critical of Colombia than they are of themselves. However, it's true for La Estrella, but it's not true for El Tiempo. El Tiempo was actually more critical of their own government than of Panama, which I thought was very interesting. They were more neutral or right-skewed, meaning that they're more supportive of their own president, their country's foreign policy, and of their government policies and facilities that support migration. But both of the newspapers were critical about security, the economy, and health, especially when it comes to the Gulf Clan, which is criminal, or it's not criminal, but it's an armed paramilitary group, kind of an offshoot of the FARC. Oh, I'm sorry. So I'll just wrap up really quickly. And they were both neutral about migrants. So again, I'm only one coder, so there's not really that intercoder reliability. This was conducted after the knowledge that Trump would become president. I'm not Latina, I'm also not really a Spanish speaker, but I try. So that could really affect the interpretation of the data. Thank you. Apologies.